Good morning, everyone. My name is Moshami Joshi, and I'm the co-VP of Programming for WIT. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the WIT Fireside Chat with Brenda Smith. Brenda recently retired as the Executive Assistant Commissioner of Trade at U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP. She's currently Global Director of Government Outreach at Expeditors, a global logistics company, and is also a WIT board member. In her role as Executive Assistant Commissioner of Trade, Brenda led CBP's trade mission, overseeing trade enforcement, security, and facilitation matters. Brenda held a variety of roles at CBP. As Executive Director for the Automated Commercial Environment ACE, she was responsible for digitization of trade processes. She also served as Executive Director for Trade Policy and Programs, the Director of Policy and Programs in the Office of International Affairs and Trade Relations, and led the CBP's Strategic Planning and Performance Division. Her long career has meant that Brenda has been at the forefront, guiding the agency through many opportunities and challenges brought on by developments in international trade, such as uptick in e-commerce, recent tariff actions such as the 232 and the 301 duties, increased focus on ethical sourcing, the pandemic, and current supply chain bottlenecks. We will discuss the impact of these events on the agency as well as implications for the agency going forward. Welcome, Brenda. To guide our discussion today, we have Emily Beeline. Emily is current WIT President, Senior Attorney for International Regulatory Affairs at FedEx, and proud new mom. In her capacity as Senior Attorney, she represents FedEx in regulatory and trade matters with an emphasis on the Asia-Pacific region. Emily advocates for FedEx before various U.S. government agencies, international fora, and collaboratively with other industry stakeholders. Prior to FedEx, Emily worked in Regulations and Rulings, Office of Trade, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, as well as with the Office of the Chief Counsel for Trade Enforcement and Compliance with the International Trade Administration, U.S. Department of Commerce. Prior to joining the U.S. federal government, Emily was a trade policy officer with the Embassy of Canada in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Emily. Finally, closing out our discussion today will be Lydia Pardini. Lydia is a partner at AMS Trade, where she counsels clients on unfair trade, import regulatory compliance, and international trade policy. She represents clients in 83 proceedings before the U.S. Department of Commerce and ITC, as well as in Section 201, 232, and 301 proceedings. Lydia is also a licensed customs broker and regularly advises on tariff classification, valuation, country of origin, and the agency's penalty and enforcement proceedings. Prior to joining AMS, Lydia was a senior attorney at the U.S. Department of Commerce in the Office of the Chief Counsel for Trade Enforcement and Compliance. Welcome, Lydia. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping notes. Please use the chat function to ask questions, and we will get to as many questions as she can at the end of the conversation. Also note that Brenda's remarks today are being made in her own personal capacity, and they do not reflect the views of her employer, Expeditors. With that, let me turn it over to Emily. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Belated but heartfelt Happy New Year's to you all. As Moshami mentioned, my name is Emily Beeline, and I'm the President of Women in International Trade. And again, I just want to reiterate also Moshami's housekeeping. If you have a question for Brenda as she's speaking, please put it in the chat. I'll be closely monitoring it. And we should have plenty of time for Q&A, so please don't be shy. I had the great pleasure and honor of moderating this conversation today with Brenda Smith. I can't imagine a more timely guest for WIT to host. As Moshami mentioned, Brenda is an accomplished woman. Having retired from her service with the U.S. government, has taken her talents to Expeditors, benefiting them and their customers. I had the pleasure of working at CBP when Brenda was the Executive Director of the ACE Business Office. And then when she became Executive Assistant Commissioner of the Office of Trade several years ago. So I can attest to her demonstrated leadership from an insider's perspective. And if I can put in a plug to those attending today who are just starting their careers in trade, working for the US government provides unrivaled experience. I always strongly encourage those who ask me for career advice to seek out public service. Like many of you, I've also seen and heard Brenda speak myriad times over the years at CBP's Trade Week, at conferences, in front of trade associations, in small meetings, and more. She's diligently delivered CBP's messaging on their work enforcing over 500 laws representing 49 federal agencies over 500 AD/CVD orders, 16 trade agreements with 21 countries, and over 17,000 unique tariff codes, all of which govern how our trade community conducts trade. And now she's on the other side. She brings all of that government knowledge and experience to her current position. So to start off our conversation, I wanted to invite you, Brenda, to reflect on your experience with the government. Maybe some particular challenges and opportunities jump out to you as pivotal to your life and your career that you would like to share with our audience.
Emily, thank you. Mushami, really am excited about the opportunity to be with you all today. As you can probably see on the wall behind me, CBP, really important part of my life. And I would not only echo, but really encourage, as Emily just said, that the government is a great place to have a career. I had 5 years on Capitol Hill, 2 years at the Department of Treasury, and then I moved to where the real action happens at the U.S. Customs Service. I had nearly 30 years at Customs and what became Customs and Border Protection. And for me, it was really, I was in the right place at the right time. I saw major transitions like the implementation of the Customs Mod Act. So for those of you that know your history, back in 1993, along with the implementation of NAFTA, I saw a major reorganization of the U.S. Customs Service. I saw the agency go through the reaction and the response to 9/11 and the shift really to a focus on border security. I had many great mentors who really pushed me to practice my skills, to think strategically, to manage programs, to collaborate with stakeholders, and make some really hard decisions that had big impact. They wanted me to take risks and were okay if I failed, but they expected me to pick up the pieces and fix it if it did fail. CBP is one of those agencies where they rarely tell you no if you want to try something. They may not make it easy. You know, there's the usual bureaucracy and the usual challenges, but it forces you to work through the barriers and to get important things done. For me, that is really government at its best, when it can organize and lead on important things. And I was really honored to given the chance to do that in areas like ACE and the single window, the establishment of the Centers of Excellence and Expertise, even things like dumping circumvention and forced labor. But lots of challenges and opportunities along the way. In Washington, I think most of us, all of you on this call and other of our colleagues as well, really recognize the economic driver that trade can be. And I think that the coordination between policy agencies like USTR, Commerce, and Treasury, and the operational agencies like Customs and the Food and Drug Administration and USDA has gotten much stronger in the last 10 years. And further, the broader public has been educated about the role of supply chains in their quality of life during the pandemic. And I think that they're open to investing in a robust and competitive trading system if the results of Kathy Novelli's listening project are anything to go by. But CBP and those of us who do trade or did trade in the government are increasingly asking trade, as is the private sector, to fill more policy goals, whether they're diplomatic, whether they're environmental, whether they're labor, human rights oriented, protection of things like seafood and timber and wildlife and other natural resources. And so I think that we really need a stronger vision to drive the US participation in the global trading system. There is a tremendous amount of infrastructure that supports the movement of goods, which is really where I'm a little biased, but that's where the rubber meets the road, is moving goods. I'm not sure that we're investing enough to ensure that it can do everything we ask of it. I don't know that we have a clear-eyed understanding of the trade-offs as we ask the trade system to address various policy goals. Let me give you an example. So many of you have worked with CBP over the years, and you know that it doesn't just do trade. Its mission set is pretty extensive, and its primary focus, believe it or not, is not on customs. It's on border security. Of its 60,000 employees, actually more than 60,000, approximately 5% are focused full-time on customs facilitation and trade enforcement. It's a very motivated and involved workforce, which has been tasked over the last few years to take on a major enforcement role in the forced labor realm, and never more so than in the last couple of weeks after the Uyghur Act was passed. At the same time, CBP is working through an extensive project to modernize how goods cross borders for the next few decades. They call it the 21st Century Customs Framework. I would argue that both efforts are really important, but that they individually require a tremendous amount of work, expertise, and investment. A former colleague, Andy Maynor, who is now a private sector leader, once advised that you could only take on at one time one major and two minors. At this point, forced labor for the agency seems to be the major. And my question is, do we want cargo movement and trade facilitation to be a minor issue? What would I do if I was in charge? So I had that opportunity over a number of years, and I did a lot. But I'll tell you, in the 9 months or so since I've been gone, not that I've changed my mind, but I've had some beliefs reinforced. One of those, and this is probably, I've had a good reminder over the last couple of months, that we need to do a better job of implementing what we have already agreed to in instruments like the revised Kyoto Convention and the Trade Facilitation Agreement, and the elements of those trade agreements that drive harmonization. So that's kind of the first thing that I would focus on. The second thing that I would focus on is investing in automation and technology, which can then result in more streamlined border processes. We're seeing this in the movement of international travelers. How many of you are members of Global Entry? Well, I tell you, if you've traveled internationally in the last 2 years, you see in certain airports, and growing every day, a pretty significant difference in standing in line, showing your passport, getting interviewed, and getting your passport stamped. Process is very different now. And my question is, let's build, well, it's not really a question, it's a recommendation. Let's build the process around cargo to be able to do the same. We have so much data and technology at our fingertips and a framework of standards, which we are not taking full advantage of. We need to better align the risk with the investment. And then the last thing that I would recommend is finding mechanisms which drive standardization and efficiency, whether that's the multilateral forums for conversation and agreement, whether it's more bilateral agreements and leadership around vision and strategy from within the federal government. The complexity of these issues, it isn't easy. We've all worked them, we've all struggled with them. They benefit most from diverse expertise and information. So pulling the private sector and the public sector together to collaborate around these issues is really critical. Thanks, Emily. I'll get off my soapbox now.
Oh no, you need to stay right there. I heard you say so many things, and I belatedly started making notes because I was like, I have to respond. This is great. Your perspective, it's actually really great that we waited almost 9 months after you left the government to ask you here today. Your responses might have been very different if we had hosted you last summer, having more recently separated from the government. You mentioned the Uyghur bill, and CBP is going to have a wish list They're going to have to go to Congress asking for more. I'd love for you to speak more on that. But what I heard you say, is, well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but did I hear you say, CBP needs more resources? And, the last time CBP got a lot more resources from TIFTIA, border security was it was pre-pandemic, and increasingly, if you're referencing something that's pre-pandemic, you might as well be referencing, the Mesozoic era, because it's all changed since then. So, it's also surprising to me. It's always surprising to me to hear, as important as trade is and the Office of Trade is for my world, to remember how big CBP is and how big and broad their scope and mandate is. So, is it more analysts? Is it more technology? What should CBP ask for from Congress in your view?
So, great opportunity to repeat myself, because it's a conversation that I had with appropriators and with the authorizing committees for years. And in general, they were tremendously supportive. They believed in the trade mission. I think generally, with some exceptions, they thought that CBP was doing a good job. But I'll tell you, the resources that CBP had to focus on, I'll call it the pure customs issues, has really not grown over the 20 years since Customs and Border Protection was stood up. It has gotten some injections along the way, but I had a colleague, pretty senior colleague, who was leading the agency, say to me, "Brenda, do you know if we doubled your budget, it would be a drop in the bucket to the larger CBP budget, and certainly against the Homeland Security budget." Now, there are a lot of calls on those resources, and whether it's FEMA or transportation security or immigration processing, there are many, many calls on those resources. But I think as a community, we need to beat the drum about the importance of the infrastructure, the expertise, the technology, the systems that make it all work. Because you can't get to those policy goals, whether it's trade remedy enforcement, human rights enforcement, facilitation of goods across borders, without investing in the infrastructure, because it's going to fall apart.
Those of us in the private sector, and particularly, in the logistics industry, and as one or a couple chains in the supply chain, that sounds similar to what my company has been saying for several years. We have independently invested in efficiencies. I know our companies have spent just exorbitant amounts of money to take advantage of the programs that the U.S. government provides, to capture those efficiencies. That's how we make money. That's how we are competitive. And now all of a sudden, supply chain, the phrase supply chain, certainly, overused perhaps. It's like a grown line, supply chain challenges. But we have captured the entire country's attention. It's top of the fold news right now. So now is the time it's convenient. Now is the time to ask for resources, because perhaps we have a more of a captured audience. Everyone suddenly knows, if you're living and working from home, you need everything to your house now. We're going to be back and forth. That's for the foreseeable future. You have touched on this. So now you're on the other side. You're bringing all of that government knowledge and expertise. What made you go in that direction? Why didn't you just decide to retire and tend to your garden, which you would have been completely entitled to do? You're just, are you a glutton for punishment?
So besides the opportunity to drive my husband and teenage son crazy by having way too much time on my hands, I frankly would have been bored. And there are just so many things to learn about our world. I feel even on trade, having worked in the trade field for decades, there is still a tremendous amount to learn. And that was really my main motivation. I wanted to see what it looked like from the other side. We have been, CBP has been, I still catch myself doing that. CBP has been a great partner with many great US businesses, not just US, but global businesses over the years. I think the agency has a deserved good reputation for collaboration, for talking to the private sector, for listening, not always, but really trying to learn. But one of the things that was always in the back of my mind when I was sitting on the government side of the table was that there were decisions being made about investments and policy positions and collaboration that I didn't understand, because I didn't understand the why behind it. And so I wanted to see that. Whenever I've gotten bored in a current position and I start looking around for something new to try, I have two criteria. One is I want to learn new things. And then the other criteria is I want to make a contribution. And I kind of started as I was thinking about what I wanted to do next with those two criteria in mind. And I also did a lot of navel gazing, talked to a lot of people incredibly gracious in the trade community with both time and sharing expertise. And while my husband would tell you that I was approaching analysis paralysis, I spent a lot of time talking to people and recognized that I like being part of a team, part of an established organization, right? I had that in the government, and I wasn't ready to be out there on my own, as many of my former colleagues are able to do. I love working with global complex issues, which involve a lot of different kinds of stakeholders. I also wanted to continue to have an impact, a strategic contribution that allowed me to really continue to move the needle on trade issues. And I needed to find an opportunity where somebody would actually pay me to do that. So after I transitioned out of CBP at the end of March, I gave myself a couple of months to do research. And of course, I enjoyed the beautiful spring weather. There was a method to my madness of transitioning at the end of March. I spent a lot of time in my garden, spent a lot of time with my family. Would have loved to take some amazing international trips, but that wasn't in the cards. So we stayed local. But during that time, I talked to people and I narrowed in on a few opportunities that met my criteria. Upon reflection, I recognized that there were a couple of organizations that were very open to looking at what my skills were to address a particular gap in their organization, which meant at the end of the day that what I was likely to be asked to do was to open up a startup, a new function in an organization, but would have the backing of that established organization, which is exactly the kind of challenge that I like to take on. I'm only about 4 months in now with my new organization and really learning every day. I find myself going back to many of my basic program management skills to make sure that I have a plan and I can produce something of value. I focus a lot on information gathering. And while my sources have changed fairly significantly, because I'm now outside of the government firewall, and it's taken me some time to really understand where those information flows come from and how to manage those and how to fill in the gaps that I have. But information's currency, so I spend a lot of time doing that. I've also been encouraged to invest pretty heavily in building the new relationships, both within my company and outside, not only to understand how they specifically do business, but how to collaborate and work with my new colleagues on forward motion. One of the surprises is the amount of time and energy that I spend understanding culture. There's a lot of business and leadership books which highlight the importance of culture, and I used to talk about it a lot, but I probably underestimated its importance. At CBP, I worked in a really strong government, law enforcement culture. But I find that it's equally important and not surprisingly different at my new organization. Another company, it might have been very different, but I think I chose an organization that I was comfortable with. And a lot of the reason I was comfortable is because the cultures are similar. However, it does keep every day interesting. So I'm learning a lot, and I feel like I'm starting to make some contributions. So check and check.
That's fantastic. And it occurs to me with a company like Expeditors, you also have two, at least two communities. You have an internal structure, and then you have customers, and you have sort of internal clients. I have internal clients. When I was with CBP, you have an internal client, but it's different when you're pivoting to work externally. You're also doubling, as you said, you're doubling the number of cultures. You have an internal culture and then the culture of your client, your customer. I'm eager to know what's the first thing you were dying to tell your customers. What was the first piece of advice for any of your customers or a particular one that jumps out at you?
Talk to the government. Pick up the phone. Go see them. It's really interesting, and I have a better sense, not a full sense now, of the reasons that companies are hesitant sometimes to bring their issues to the government. But I also find an even greater number that they either don't know how, they don't know who to reach out to, or they'll pick up the phone and have a conversation with a service provider, they won't necessarily think to do that with a government official. And that government official, is a person, right? Person who has relationships, who has information. And so talking to customers now or colleagues about the importance of those conversations is really a piece of advice that I found giving my first week, and I continue to give.
That makes sense to me. I've been in Washington for about 15 years now, and I never hesitated to call up my friends or former colleagues. With the government, we operate, as many companies do that have DC offices. You operate through a trade association, and you always seek a meeting, but that occurs to me, and that just may not occur to some of your customers, or if they just don't have a large, it's like a plug for living in DC. If they don't have a large DC presence, maybe, not knowing that it's the government's role and obligation to meet with the public, through one-on-one meetings, and then also through the comment process, the notice and comment process. And I know that we take advantage of that. It's the bulk of what my daily job is figuring out how to explain to the government a problem and to present a solution. Mm-hmm. I feel like that's something I took from the government when I arrived at my current position, was to don't just come to the government with problems, come to them with a solution, a proposed solution. Because government's not just going to solve your problem the way you want them to necessarily. But yes, I couldn't agree more that engaging with the public, speaking at conferences, going to conferences, participating in your trade association is really valuable experience. So I'm glad to hear you say that, and I'm sure that your customers are grateful to have you reminding them of that, or to be there to their voice to the government.
Let's hope so. The part of my current role now is to help people do that effectively. And I think, you put your finger on one of the key things, which is don't just come with problems, come with solutions, right? That's just a leadership thing. But I also think things like going in prepared, knowing who to talk to or asking who to talk to, recognizing that the government operates at different levels, just like private sector organizations. So you may start with a program officer, and if you don't get the hearing you're looking for, you don't get the answer you want, you can elevate. Now, you don't want to make a pain of yourself, but you can talk to people that maybe have a wider vision or are weighing commitments or answers across a broader portfolio and may have a different sense of the solution. But I also think it's really important to do your homework when you do go in. The other thing that I think is important is if you come in with a really hairy issue that you need help on, it's going to go much better if you already have a relationship. And, I think this works well in the US. There are other countries and cultures where a relationship with the government is not viewed as above board necessarily, or can be trickier to navigate. And so I think it is really important to know the culture that you're working within. I think, as you pointed out, that trade associations can be a great opportunity, but it's got to be the right one that advocates on the right issues in a way that your company's culture is comfortable with. And so as putting together strategies around government engagement, you've got to weigh, how does this work with your culture?
You're reminding me that we often work with the customs agents or customs attaches that are embedded in the embassies worldwide. We often engage with, instead of going to headquarters here in DC, we'll speak with the customs, the CBP officials that are located in the embassies. They're going to have on the ground experience, from back here in the United States, from imports that way, but also how goods enter and leave any particular country. That's a good point to make. I wouldn't mind getting back to advice that you're giving and what you're seeing now on the ground, particularly it just, hot off the press is the forced labor, the renewed focus on forced labor, the increased, we were talking about increased resources, increased investments, knowledge and understanding, investment in technology, but also, like I said, people resources for CBP. And it sounds a lot like CBP is going to be asking the private sector to shoulder some of that burden as well. To capturing efficiencies has to be on both sides. I know from experience, a company that participates in imports to the US can have the most state-of-the-art technology possible, but if the government can't read it, then you're gonna end up with a gap there. But you need companies to also shoulder some of that, and they're going to be looking for benefits, correlated benefits, if they're going to invest a lot of that money. I wouldn't mind your reaction to some of that.
I will tell you the requirements that have developed, and I would say it's not unique to forced labor. I think we're seeing some of the environmental requirements, for example, in the EU, and other related issues where the expectation about knowing your supply chain or having control over your supply chain is a huge challenge. And I will tell you, 2020 hindsight, have a much better sense of what is possible. And I think I am a big believer and a big supporter of the comment period and the comment opportunities related to the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. I think that that can set the stage for a great conversation between the private sector and the government. I am a little concerned that there are individual companies that may not want to talk about the gaps in their supply chain, and maybe multinational companies that have to have a relationship with China and have to be a little careful about how they implement the law. And so I would urge the government to provide the opportunity for having those kind of conversations, because there is a lot of information to be had from companies trying to do business around the world. The investments that we're asking companies to make, I think are pretty significant. But I think also corporations recognize it's good business, not just to be compliant with government requirements, but very often they are consistent with the way they do business anyway, right? Streamline processing, know where your risks are, make sure your personnel are educated and expert, things like that. They all kind of fall into the package. However, I think there is an opportunity for the government to take a step back and understand we've gotten into this cycle of new requirements. I need new benefits. More requirements. I need new benefits. And I almost think that benefits it's the wrong conversation. The right conversation, since you asked, is more about what do we really want this to look like? And I think that what we don't have the best understanding of is the alignment between investment and risk. What is the risk? Where have we mitigated the risk? And so where can we take a bit of a step back? And where can we let trade flow because we've mitigated the risk? I'm not sure that we have a solid understanding of exactly where that risk is in a quantitative fashion and where we can take a step back and let trade flow. That is a conversation that I would love to see us have, because I think that at the end of the day, it will benefit private sector, the public sector, and the economy and the public at large.
There's some challenges in that. I mean, that's a great insight on that. You've given me a lot to think about. I know that companies listening in today, doing that risk benefit analysis, feeling trapped that they have to operate globally, they have to operate everywhere, where populations are, and now being told that they need to shift. Supply chains don't shift on a dime. They've been established over years, and even traceability standards, which a buzz term that I've worked with for a decade now. Now all of a sudden having to rethink and having to convince an executive chain that may not see that risk. I don't know. You made me think of a lot of things. I'm hoping that some of our audience members have some more questions on that. That's just it's really strong perspective that you're bringing from both sides. The new administration's focus on this, which feeds directly into the health of the current economy. I work for a large multinational corporation that has to balance those risks, but the bulk of our customers are small and medium-sized companies who are panicking if their goods are going to get caught at the border, if they're going to be held liable for not for having to catch up on their supply chain, for perhaps not concentrating on the risks that certain countries pose, even 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and now all of a sudden having to shift. There's a lot there. Thank you very much for that. A question from the audience came in. It's actually pivoting a bit, reflecting on the fact that CBP is an enforcement operation and may suffer a little bit of an old boys club. You clearly successfully navigated that to the top. Given that certain organizations lack diversity, especially among women in leadership ranks, what are some of the lessons that you've learned that maybe you could tell women as they navigate their careers in this space?
This is a conversation over a glass of wine. It's, I think you have to go in focused on the work and what you can bring to the work. One of the things that I brought at CBP was a different perspective. And when I talked about diversity, it was less about who else do I see in the room and more what diverse perspectives am I hearing? And for me, it wasn't always easy being the only. It can be a bit isolating. And I had to learn when to speak up, when to make my views known, and how to do it in a way that could be heard. Does that mean that it was harder than it should have been? Perhaps, but that was the time that I grew up in. But it was also the opportunity that I had to bring that to the table. Should there be more of it? Yes, absolutely. And not just for women. There's all kinds of diversity of thought that needs to be represented in the decision-making process. I found, though, that having mentors of all kinds who would tell me the truth, point me towards things that I was missing, which happened a lot, and helped me think through situations that I was challenged by was invaluable. And they say that a lot, right? Oh, you have to have a mentor. You have to have a mentor. What does that really mean? A lot of times for me, it took the range between sounding board to problem solver to coach to sponsor. There's been a lot of conversation about sponsors versus mentors. And for me, sponsors are those that help put you forward for opportunities. They help to make opportunities. They don't give you jobs or give you roles necessarily, but they make sure that others are aware of your qualifications and your ability to fill a certain opportunity. And I think that as a community, we need to continue to do more of that. I certainly found that, in the 6 months after I left CBP, was many people's willingness to share opportunities, share information, share guidance, and help me. And I wouldn't be where I was without that. But I'll also tell you that for many years, I've done the same for others. And have put time into forming relationships, keeping those relationships green, so that when I called, and there were a lot of cold calls that I made, but my first calls were to people that I already knew and knew me. And so, but that required setting aside a certain amount of my time and energy over the years. I didn't always do as much as I would have liked, but setting aside that time and energy as a way to promote diversity, promote my expertise, but also often a voice that might have been missing from the conversations.
I spent so long in my early career thinking I could just hard work my way ahead and avoid any sort of introspection where I challenged my own communication style, because my communication style is correct objectively. And I'm now reflecting, obviously that's wrong. But you're reminding me that, men and women and anyone who is unlike me, those relationships should be fostered, should be cultivated, so that I can get a better sense of always trying to be a little bit better. I spend a lot of more time now, reflecting on my presence, my views. It's a little bit more policing than I previously had done, which can be uncomfortable for me. Should I say it this way or should I say it that way? How do I get more flies with honey, than vinegar type of analysis? But if I don't do that, if I don't challenge myself now, I feel like I would become entrenched, and those become bad habits. And I'm never going to get ahead. I speak with a lot of women younger than me, looking to just start their career, and I can really freeze up. I'm like, oh, I don't know what to tell you. And I don't know, I need to continue speaking in my perspective, with women of all perspectives, so that I can keep challenging myself. That's sort of what I just got from what you said.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a great summary of what I was trying to say.
Another question from the audience. Is there anything that CBP could be doing better, perhaps with more resources, to help alleviate supply chain bottlenecks at the port? This sounds like a pretty port specific. And I know I also can echo that, experiences port to port differ greatly, but more than just an open communication or a relationship establishment. What do you think that companies should be doing?
Yeah, and I admit my bias, right? My CBP focus. I tend to still think CBP is the center of the universe. Clearly it's not, but that is my bias. And I've done a lot of listening and talking to people about, what's the solution? Why is this so hard? And I think there are efforts to try to gather information, because the solution, let's just look at the Port of Los Angeles or Port of Long Beach, really. The solution is multifaceted, right? There are so many gaps there that need to be addressed. Is it a government role? I don't know. Is it a government role to convene? Maybe. Is it a multi-stakeholder issue? Yes. Is information a huge part of that? Yes. Information and visibility. Does the government already have that information? In many cases, yes. I spent a significant part of my career helping to build the single window, right? Which was supposed to be the portal for information about trade crossing borders. Now, what's going on in Long Beach is not about crossing borders only. There's a lot of stuff about, drayage and warehouse space and terminals and that wouldn't be captured in the single window. But when I hear conversations about more visibility, more data, what I'm not seeing is the link between organization X and CBP that are trying to come up with solutions. So I guess I would just urge those of us that have an opportunity to weigh in, that those integrated solutions, working together, kind of sorting through the issues, really have to be the answer. Because if we continue to stovepipe or silo things, we're going to be right back where we started.
Yeah, you're reminding me that, I just tons and tons and tons of data is not in of itself an answer.
Right.
It has to be the right data. And like I said, my company has exorbitant amounts of data. We can't just dump it on your doorstep and have you sort it out. That's targeted, that you lose efficiency there. But there's that it's in and of itself is not I think in our perspective, that's not the solution.
I would absolutely agree. More data is not necessarily better.
Better data. Better data is better. Well, I think we could continue talking, and I know that you and I have continued talking about some of these conversations. In previously, we had done it with a glass of wine, so perhaps next time this becomes a happy hour event. But I wanted to give you just a last couple minutes, if there's anything else you'd like our community to know. My final question was, what are you? We got a last minute edition. What would one thing importers need to do right now to better prepare for forced labor enforcement? Excuse me. This is a broad question, I guess, but what is one thing that importers should do right now? And then I'll turn the floor over to Lydia.
Yes, so I would say do as much as you can, and that's a soft answer, but at a minimum, you've got to have a good system in place. And let's not take this the wrong way, but you have to have a good story to tell, right? When you talk to your board of directors, you talk to your customers, you've got to be able to show them that you've done the due diligence. You know who your suppliers are. What you expect of your suppliers is in your commercial documents, that you've taken the opportunity to train them if that's appropriate. You've gone there, you've seen, within the limits of the pandemic travel, but that you've done the due diligence, and not just the paper due diligence, not just relying on a third-party validator, but you've actually taken the standards, and they're out there, to put a system in place, because it'll benefit you not only on the forced labor front, but everything else that the government is going after, all the ESG standards. It will help you if you have that compliance system in place.
I think that's a great point. And I want to thank you so much for your perspectives today. I really could have used some extra time to reflect on your advice, your perspective from so long with the government, but now just seeing that other side. I've been on the other side of the table with you many times, with companies, similarly situated to my company in the supply chain. And I know that you get it. But I also know that you have to listen to all of the other voices, that have a different perspective than my company does. Those are the battles that I'm used to fighting. But the extra perspective from the other side, from we also in the private sector have crunches on. We have goals and pressures on our companies and internally. And now I feel like, it's really valuable that you see the other side. And I am glad that you're not just gardening. I'm certainly glad that you're still with us in the trade community. We're better for it. Lydia Pardini is a co-chair of the Supply Chains Committee with WIT, and I'm going to turn the floor over to her for final closing words. Thank you, Brenda.
Yes, thank you, Brenda and Emily, both of you. That was a really fascinating conversation. I appreciated both of your unique perspectives on how the agency has approached and might approach future issues that and challenges that it's facing right now. To close, I wanted to tie into a couple of the topics that you discussed in the earlier portion of this hour, while adding a couple of thoughts of my own about what I, as a practitioner, am thinking about as we look forward. So, first we talked a little bit about the growth in e-commerce, which is only likely to continue, and the challenges that that's presenting to CBP. E-commerce was, of course, already on the rise, fueled more recently by the COVID-19 pandemic, which pushed even more of us to order more to our doorstep than we were doing before. Things that I would normally have purchased at the hardware store, I'm now having delivered, and I know that I'm not the only one. And not only am I doing that, but I'm spending money on things rather than on services. And all of that shift is changing the volume of goods and the manner in which they enter the U.S. Also, the average importer's familiarity with U.S. customs laws and regulations under this new e-commerce focus is, I think, very different than the more sophisticated importers that you might have seen previously. And you're also seeing, I think, a lot more counterfeit goods out there. And so as the agency is confronting all of this, I'm keeping a close eye on what the agency's e-commerce strategies are, including the Section 321 data pilot, which has now been extended, and other mechanisms that the agency is using to adapt, and how importers need to adapt in response to all of that. I'm also looking out for political attempts to close what I think could be a growing duty and enforcement loophole, which is, as we all know, in 2016, the US raised the de minimis import threshold from $200 to $800, meaning that most goods valued at $800 or less now are entering the US duty-free and with expedited processing. But as more imports fall under this umbrella, fueled again by e-commerce in part, including imports that would otherwise be subject to special duties or restrictions, for example, the Section 301 duties on Chinese imports, or potentially products made with forced labor, as we discussed earlier today. At what point does this $800 threshold no longer make sense, or do we need some sort of boundaries that are placed on it? We're seeing attempts to address this issue already with the Import Security and Fairness Act introduced in the House last week. If passed in its current form, it would prohibit non-market economies like China and certain other countries and goods from benefiting from this de minimis provision, and also require CBP to take new actions to better enable future enforcement. But I know that we have, 56 participants in this meeting right now, so I'm sure we have 56 different perspectives on the likelihood of congressional action to address this issue. I'll be monitoring it. It may not be the version that passes, but it's still an ongoing issue, and one that we're going to have to confront it at some point in the future. We also talked quite a bit today about the issue of forced labor and ethical sourcing and insight into supply chains. I think working with US manufacturers, foreign manufacturers, importers, this obviously presents a unique challenge for both CBP and for manufacturers and importers who may be incredibly well-intentioned and want to source ethically, but lack sufficient insight into their supply chains. And we talked today about some of the tools that are in development or currently out there, and what might be workable both for companies and for the government to address this issue. I think one of the other things that we see a lot is importers' confusion, or fueling that confusion, is the perceived lack of clear communication from CBP about what it's looking for from importers. So I think that conversation between importers and CBP that we discussed in the close of Emily's and Brenda's conversation is going to be incredibly important, both with regard to WROs and also now under the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. So how can importers demonstrate lack of forced labor in their supply chains? I think, or perhaps hope, that all manufacturers are eager to eliminate it from their supply chains, but how do we demonstrate that from CBP? What is it that CBP needs? And then finally, not quite finally, but if forced labor is getting a lot of airtime, it's only one of the multitude of priority enforcement initiatives the agency is undertaking. We didn't touch on it quite as much today, but the number of duties and import restrictions have grown exponentially over the past 5 years. Emily mentioned at the top of this that there are over 500 AD/CVD orders currently being enforced. We have Section 301 duties on Chinese imports, Section 232 duties on steel and aluminum. There have been a growth in Section 337 exclusion orders and other IPR issues that the agency is enforcing and ensuring don't enter US commerce. So Customs has dedicated an increasing number of resources to all of these actions, including in 2015, it was granted authority to address evasion of AD/CVD duties. We're also seeing a number of importer audits that are focused on making sure that imports are following all of these various duties and correctly reporting the application of those duties to CBP. But I think as Brenda also touched on today, all of these enforcement routes require resources, and there are only so many resources available out there. So how is CBP going to continue to prioritize these various issues? And I'm also curious what other enforcement mechanisms we might be seeing in the future. Right now, some of these are being addressed primarily through audits, but the EPA enforcement mechanism for AD/CVD duty evasion was a unique one. So is it possible that we would see something like that in the future for other types of duties? And then finally, tying all of this together is, I think, additional pressure we're seeing right now on the tie between supply chain issues and inflation, which is, again, a hot topic. As Emily joked earlier, right now, supply chains are a buzzword. I think we're all, despite working in it, almost sick of hearing it. And I think as we approach this in a midterm election year, these are going to add additional political pressures on both sides of things that could both prompt or stall action. So as we look through all of these additional options that are available to us, how many of those are able to be undertaken this year? How many of those are we looking at in the future? Thanks to Emily, and I'll pass the microphone back to you and Mashani.
Thank you all. This has been a fascinating discussion, and thank you to our participants for joining us today. With that, this meeting is closed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.